everyone, Cynthia here in my quilt lab. Welcome back as I continue to work on this Illusion Sampler Block of the month. It is month 2. I'm working on this guy right here. And just as before, I'm taking it step by step. The first step is the cutting instructions for the 12 by 12 block. So that's what I have placed out here before you. This is my Scrappy version. I have another video that has the beautiful batiks recommended with this block of the month. And just as before, I'm not going to be discussing the sizes of each of the shapes. I want you to go out and buy this great pattern by Scott Flanagan. Excuse me. Sorry, Scott. And support these great designers and these great fabric designers, and, you know, keep it all above bar. So you notice here I have my background number 1. It's this lovely peach color. It comes in, we need to cut 4 different sizes. 1 of the big, 8 of the next size, 4 of the next size, and 12 of the smallest. Now 2 of these squares are going to be cut diagonally for half square triangles. That's the biggest. And the third is going to be cut just on the diagonal for half square triangles. And then I have 2 squares each of fabrics 1, 6, 7, and 9. And then from fabric 3, I have 4 rectangles and then 1 big square. And this big square is also going to be cut in half diagonally to make some half square triangles. So that's the fabric we have for the main block. Let's move on to the piecing instructions. Okay, to begin with, we're going to be doing those half square triangles, and we're going to be using the second size of the background 1 and all of those pairs of the 4 different types of fabrics. Now, the instructions tell you to pair them up and then make this diagonal line, draw a diagonal line across the middle of it, and then you're going to sew on either side. This is a great opportunity if you have one of those easy 1/4 inch rulers to make half square triangles a little easier. And I have one that has slots in between, so you can actually draw all 3 lines, the middle line, and the 2/4 inch. And what I like to do is I like to put my piece of fabric on one of the lines, one of the mat lines, and then line up my ruler over the top. So if you can see that, the slotted section is where that diagonal is, and it's going to be a dashed line when I take my pencil to it. And then I'm going to draw out the line on either side of that as well. And I'm just using a basic pencil because it's pretty light fabric. I don't have to make it too dark. There we go. Just like I said, there's lots of these rulers out there. Some of them have that slot, some of them don't. So find one that works for you. And same thing with pencils. You know, if you can use your basic pencil, or there's tons of other fabric pencils out there that you can use as well. So once you have your lines on it, then you can start pairing it up with the different pieces of fabric. Make sure it's on there nice and square. And you're going to be stitching on the 2 lines on either side of that diagonal. So that's the 1/4 inch. Once you're finished, you're going to cut on that dash line, and then you can open everything up and give it a good press. The instructions tell you to press towards the different variety of fabrics instead of to the background, because those are the darker fabrics. So I'm going to take a little pause, and I'm going to do all this, and then we're going to come back and talk about squaring up these half square triangles. Okay, I'm back, and I have done all my stitching, and I've pressed everything open towards those alternate colors. We need to talk about squaring up right now. Now, if you look on the mat here, it's just a smidgen bigger than 2.5, and the instructions do that on purpose so that you can square down to the 2.5 and have really nice crisp squares. So before we do that, I want to talk about a couple of things that I like to have on hand that makes squaring up just a little bit easier. The first thing is having a square ruler, and right now I'm using Omnigrid, but there are other great options out there like Creative Grids, Fiskars, Missouri Star even has some really great options out there too. The biggest thing you want to look for, in my opinion, is something that's square but also has this diagonal, that 90-degree diagonal that goes across, because that's what we're going to be using to line up on the diagonal of the half square triangles. I'm also using some blue painter's tape to outline my 2.5-inch square, and I just do that to give my eyes a quick reference to go to, so I don't have to look for, you know, the dash lines or the dots or anything that's on the rulers. The next thing I like to do, especially when I'm doing a lot of squaring up, is break out my Rotary, or my rotating mat. This is a Fiskars product, but there's other products out there that are very similar. It's 12 by 12, and like you can see, it rotates. So that means I'm not having to touch the fabric and lift it up and move it around. I'm just rotating the mat so that I can make nice crisp cuts. So let's make a nice crisp cut. You can see that I put it on the mat and I've lined it up on squares where that diagonal line goes all the way through. It's just kind of an added measure that I like to do. I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to set it down, and I'm using both the ruler and the mat to look for that 2.5-inch line right there and right there. And I'm using my diagonal on the ruler to line up with the diagonal of the half square triangle. And I'm just making sure everything looks pretty before I grab my rotary cutter. Putting my hand down squarely on the ruler, making sure my fingers are away from the edges because we don't want any accidents. Please don't cut off anything important. Oh, it looks pretty good to me. So let me grab my rotary cutter. I'm going to do 2 cuts this way. Take away those scraps. I'll release the ruler, and I'm going to rotate the mat 180 degrees. Gently pick the ruler up. Oh, and I moved it. Well, in the perfect world, that wouldn't have moved. A little adjustment to make sure I hit those pretty lines, 2.5 and 2.5, and we do it again. So now you can see that it's matching where my blue tape is. Got the diagonal line across. Got my rotary cutter. And there we go. So we're going to do that with all of the half square triangles. We're going to shape them up and cut them down to size. And then we'll move on to the piecing part. We'll be right back. Okay, we got all of our half square triangles squared up. We're only going to be using 3 of the 4 of each color, so put that other one aside for the time being. We can use it somewhere else. Let's talk about the next step. This is about getting one of the squares ready. You're going to be getting your background big triangles and small triangles and Fabric 3's big triangle. So let's grab it and let me show you what it's going to look like. Triangle here. Triangle here. These other 2 are going to be set aside for something else. And then the big triangle is going to go right here. And what you're going to do is you're going to do this seam first. You're going to press towards the triangle. Then put this seam and again press towards the triangle. And once those 3, there'll be a big triangle. It'll match the size of this one. So when you do that center seam, you'll then press towards the big triangle. You're going to do this same layout with the purple as well. But when you come to the green and the blue, instead of using, because you'll be out of backgrounds, instead of using those backgrounds, you'll be using one of the big red triangles. And all of that's in the instructions. I'm going to move to the sewing machine and get these done, and we'll be back to work on the flying geese after this. Okay, there are the 4 blocks that we just finished, and before we move on, I just want to throw out a couple of tips. When I was sewing the 2 big pieces together, the pieced one and the big triangle, I put it under the machine this way with the patches face up, so that when I do that seam, I can make sure that I hit that crisscross of the 1/4 inch from the seams from the colored pieces of fabric. That way you get as nice of a point as you possibly can. And I'm pretty pleased with all of those things. I also want to throw out the tip that a lot of this fabric is all on the bias. So when you're sewing it, make sure that you're being cognizant of that. And what I do to help everything kind of run smoothly is I pull out my best press and give it a little spray and a little press before I do the seam. It just seems to help keep everything smooth and keeps it from stretching. And one more thing, after these are all done, they should square up to 4.5. And if they don't, you can give it a little trim. Let's move on to those flying geese. All right, for the flying geese, you're going to be using the rest of those background 1 squares and then the red rectangle squares. What the instructions have you do is they're going to have you draw that diagonal line, kind of like what we did with the half square triangles. And the first one you're going to set just right on top of your red, and you're going to actually seam stitch on that center line right there. Now you'll see in the instructions that this will actually be the dashed line to indicate the stitching, and then there will be another line that's a 1/4 inch out, just like we had with using this ruler. And what that line is indicating is that's where you're going to trim off. So I'm going to go and do this seam really quickly, and then I'm going to come back and show you what happens when we cut that off and open it up. So I'll be right back. Okay, I've done the seam, and like I said in the instructions, it'll show a little 1/4 inch line. I'm not going to do it, but I am going to put my ruler just a 1/4 inch away from that seam, and I'm going to trim off the extra. So there's a little extra piece, and what you want to do is this is going to be folded out to make that pretty corner of the flying geese. Give this a nice press, and then once you've done that, put your second one over on the other side, stitch, and then trim just the same way. Press it open the same way, and you got your flying geese. So I'll be right back and show you what the end product looks like. Okay, there's the second seam done. So let me just grab my ruler and let's trim off that extra 1/4 inch. You can hear Maxie in the background encouraging me. And then we'll just press that open. Here we go. All right, let's do that 3 more times. All right, all of the flying geese are now finished, and they're all nicely pressed. I gave them a little spray of best press to make sure they're nice and crisp. We're going to be adding the half square triangles now to either ends of these, and this is what the layout looks like in the instructions. So you're going to do the 2 seams, and then when you press them, you're going to press outwards towards those half square triangles. Once we're finished with this, we'll be closer to finishing that 12-inch block. Let me do this and I'll be right back. All right, so there's the flying geese units. You can see that they're all pressed towards the half square triangles. So we're going to set these aside for just 1 step and go towards the center of the block. The center of the block are those little half square triangle units that we did. The instructions look a little like this. There you go. So we're going to do the 2 center seams first. We're going to press towards the dark red. And then once the 2 rows are done, we're going to press up. So let me do that and I'll be right back. Okay, so there's our center block. It's all done, pressed and ready to go. Look at how pretty that is. Just a little tip. Sometimes when you're sewing, you don't quite get those pretty angles and you notice it's a little off center, right? So when I go to make this seam here, I'm just going to pay extra special attention to that corner so I can make sure that matches up. But that's something for the future. The next step is making rows out of these pieces. You notice I brought in the last 4 of the backgrounds. We're going to add the squares to the top row and to the bottom. You're going to see, according to the instructions, we're going to press out towards those squares for both of these. We're then going to attach the 2 units, the 2 flying geese units, to either side of that main block in the center. And those are going to get pressed in. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about putting the rows into the last block. Let's go to the sewing machine. Okay, so there's our 3 rows for that main block. The next step is to add the rows to each other. And we're going to be pressing the seams out towards the outer edge. I just want to make note that I'm going to make sure that when I pin it, I'm going to pin at each one of these 1/4 inch points along both sides. And when I sew, I'm going to sew with this piece, that main middle piece on top. That way when I'm stitching, I can make sure my needle really hits that little 1/4 inch hexie mark that we have right there, so that we get some nice crisp points where the patches meet each other. All right, so I'm going to do that next, and we'll be back with a finished 12.5 inch block, or unfinished 12.5 inch block. See you in a bit. And there's the finished 12-inch block. It's ready to go. Give us a nice press. Make sure all those seams are flat. And remember, there's a couple of spots, like right here, these 2 spots that are a little bulky. Just want to give you a heads up about that. Give it a nice press to keep it flat. Set it aside, and we're moving on to the accent strips next. All right, we're doing the cutting directions for the accent strips for the block 2. And here I go. Here's everything all nicely labeled. For background 3, we have small blocks and bigger blocks. We have a bunch of smaller blocks from background 4. That's this kind of limey green. It's going to have you have some fusible web product, is what the instruction says. The designer, Scott, suggests Heat and Bond or Steam and Steam Lite, and those are the 2 that I like. I'm using Steam and Steam 2 Lite. Now that said, there are other products out there, so feel free to use whatever product you're familiar with or comfortable with. Just make sure that the instructions allow you to be able to stitch through it, because some of the fusibles out there can really gunk up your needles, so just be careful of that. All right, moving on, you're using all of the different colors of fabric, the whole rainbow, so to speak. From fabrics 3, 4, and 9, you have a nice big square, and you had quantity of 3 of them. Now notice it says a total of 3, even though it says 3 in parentheses. You're just cutting 1 of each. I got stuck on that. So total of 3. So 3 fabrics, 1, 2, 3. Again, from fabrics 1, 2, and 7, a total of 3. That's 1 of each of these smaller squares. And from fabrics 1 through 9, you need a total of 10. Now 9, of course, only adds up to 9. That means you're going to have to duplicate 1 of them. It doesn't tell you which one to duplicate. If you look at the pictures, it's that fabric 3. I'm actually doing a duplicate of fabric for, because that's what I have the most fabric of. So I guess this is a chance for you to get creative, or you can just follow what you see in the directions as well. So that's all the fabric. Let's move on and get to that piecing. All right, piecing instructions for these accent strips. The first ones, we're going to be grabbing all the background 4 little squares and all those rectangles. Remember, there's 9 colors of fabric, but 10 pieces, so make sure one of them are duplicated. In the picture, it shows the red, but I'm actually using 2 of the greens because that's what I had in my scrap bin. We're going to be making flying geese, and you may remember this from block number 1. I'll just go over it really quickly. The instructions are going to have you put a diagonal strip or line down the center, and you can use a ruler, you can use your little half square triangle ruler that does this. All you need is that one diagonal for this moment. I like to put it on a nice line, and I'll just use the ruler real quick. And I'm just using a regular lead pencil, just keep it a nice light line. Again, feel free to use whatever marking device you prefer, whatever ruler you prefer. There's no quilt police here and no wrong answers. So we got the diagonal line. Grab your first rectangle. You're going to be actually stitching on that line right across. When you're finished, you're going to give it a quick little press, bring it back here, and you're going to cut off that extra piece of fabric up here so that when you fold it over and press it open, that'll be half of the flying geese. Once that's done, you're going to do the same thing on the other side. But do remember that you have to do this whole process first, the stitching, the cutting, the pressing, and the opening up, before you can add that other side. Otherwise, you get kind of a messed up fold. Alrighty, so I'm going to do all the first halves of all my rectangles. I'll come back and then we'll talk about the second halves, and we'll move and groove with block number 2. Here we go. All right, so here's the first half of that flying geese. Got it all stitched out. I'm going to cut off the extra, all this stuff over here, and place my 1/4 of an inch right on top of that seam. Cut away that. And then I'm going to press this up and out. Give it a little finger press right now. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, only on the other side. So there's my square. Make sure it's nice and straight. I'm going to stitch that, and then I'm going to cut that extra off and flip it open so that I'll have a finished square that looks something like that. So do that 10 times so that you have 10 flying geese, and then we'll come back and move on to the next step. All right, we got our 10 flying geese. I put them in a pretty kind of rainbow by color. All right, so you're going to be making 2 units out of these 10 flying geese. You're going to be making a unit of 2, and then the rest is going to be in a unit of 8. 2 plus 8 is 10. Little quilt math for you. So in the book, you'll see that it's actually doubling the red, but I doubled the green. So my layout is going to look a little different color-wise than what you see in the instructions. In the instructions, it has you start with the red and orange, and that's the 2. But I doubled those greens instead of those reds. So what I did is I kind of laid mine out right now in kind of a rainbow to kind of get it in a pretty order. So I still get that rainbow effect that block has. So I'm going to make my 2 unit out of that green and yellow, and I'm going to do the 8 unit out of the rest of them. Let's see if that all shows up on camera. Yeah, there we go. So that's what my layout is going to be. So it's going to have you, of course, stitch all these lines, and when you press them open to put them together, it's going to have you press towards the big triangle. So that way, kind of follow the arrow, so to speak. Now when I go to stitch these, I'm first going to make sure that everything is squared up as nice as possible. And when I go to put the seam on, I'm going to stitch with that on top. See, because when I want to stitch it, I want to hit that little cross, because that's the quarter. Because then when I open it up, we won't get any of the points chopped off. All right, so that's the next step. Stitch, 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 and press. And you'll be ready with this strip. And we'll be moving on to the second accent strip, to the sewing machine. All right, so we finished our flying geese units. We can set these aside for the moment. Grab the rest of the materials that's left from this cutting instructions, and we're going to do the applique circles. Now in the instructions it said to cut 6 squares of the fusible web product, whatever you chose. I just have a sheet, so I didn't cut it up. If you measure the circle, there's a circle in your instructions that you're going to be tracing to put on there. The circle's about 2 1/4 diameter. And you can place your fusible over the top of it, or use a light board or the window to trace. I went and scoured around the house and found a vitamin cap that I'm going to be using. It's just a smidgen bigger than the circle, but I figured that'll be pretty darn close to what we need. So that's what I'm going to use. It's a little easier for me than putting it up against the window, and this is a little thick, so I can't quite see through the paper. Just a little option for you. You're going to be making 6 little circles of this on your paper side. Let me move this fabric. You'll see that there's 2 sides to your thing. I'm using the grid side so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And then we're going to cut out these circles and make some appliques out of our little squares that we have left. So step 1, making circles. All right, I got the fusible attached. I'm going to cut out the circles so that I can then adhere them to the squares. So let me cut these up and I'll be right back. All right, I got my 6 little applique circles, and I'm going to center those on the corresponding squares. We're putting the colored circles on the backgrounds and the backgrounds on the different colored squares. So what I would suggest to do, because of course you want this to be as centered as possible, right? Is put a square on your cutting mat so that you get a nice center line. So there's a nice center line, and there's a nice center line. That way, when you take the adhesive, the paper off the back, you'll have a better idea of where to place it. Now, not to say that it might be interesting to have some offset squares, right? This is your quilt after all. Well, I'm going to follow the instructions in this matter, and I'm going to center them as best as I can. Please follow the instructions according to your fusible web product. Some of them are a little different. And I'm going to stick them on. I'm going to use my iron to heat it and glue it all down. And we'll be back at the next step to make the accent strip. To the iron. Okay, I have everything adhered. It's all ironed on there. It's all stuck good. The next instructions say to applique these circles in place using your favorite stitch. He does tell you that the sample was done using a blanket stitch with a width of 2.0 and a length of 3.0, but feel free to use what works for you. If you prefer a zigzag, or if that's the only stitch you have, use that one. If you want something a little bit more decorative, put that on. If you like your stitches to be a little longer or a little shorter, this is your chance to make this quilt your own. There's also no instructions on what thread to use. So again, you know, pick what works for you. I'm actually going to choose this background color for every single one of them. And you'll see here's the thread that I'm choosing. It's a Gutermann. And that blends pretty well as far as I'm concerned. But you have the option of picking yellow for this, and blue and orange and green and violet and red, and matching to what the colored fabric is on in each block. So go crazy, have fun, make it your own. Now I'm going to take this and do a little, probably a blanket stitch. That's kind of what I like, and I'll be back and we'll talk about putting this all together. All right, there's my finished applique squares with circles. Put them in the order it shows in the book: green, yellow, violet, blue, red, orange. And you're going to sew all of these together. And when you're finished, you're going to press them all towards the right. Once those seams are done, the 2 accent strips have been completed, and we'll be moving on to the sewing machine. Okay, we have reached the cutting directions for the block assembly. There's several pairs of sizes plus one lone little square for the corner. Go ahead and lay it all out on your board or table or, you know, wherever, so you can see what it's going to look like. Just like the blocks before, it's going to tell you how to piece it together. Do your sashings first around your main 12 block. Press seams out. Then start in on the sashing. Press the seam out. That'll do the top area. Put those together. Seam goes towards the middle. And then you can move to that bottom couple of rows. Attach your square and your rectangle to either side of the flying geese unit. Press out. And then attach that unit to your applique circles and squares and press down. Now you'll have 2 big squares. When you do that last seam together, you'll press them up towards that main unit. Lots of steps here covered. Be sure you pay attention to your instructions, especially those arrows, for pressing, because that's important, because you'll see some nice nesting in several different areas for you to use pins to make sure you get some nice crisp points. I'm going to take this to the sewing machine in different steps, and I'll show you what it looks like when we get to the end. To the sewing machine! And there she is. Month number 2 for this Block of the Month program of Illusions by Scott Flanagan. Let me just turn her over real quick so you can take a quick look at the seams. There you go. See how they nicely nestled right there. I did have to go back and iron this one. I hope I make a note of it later in the video so you guys don't do it either. But this one was supposed to go in, and I originally had it going that way. Live and learn though, right? I do want to point out there are a couple of really thick parts right here. That's a pretty bulky. So just to be something to be aware of when you go to quilt this. There she is. Give her a nice little press. Use some of that best press on her to keep her nice and crisp, and then set her aside. And we'll continue the adventure with month number 3. Thanks so much for joining me on my scrappy version of month number 2. And I hope to see you in the next ones. Have a good one. This is Cynthia in my quilt lab, saying goodbye for now.
Cynthia here. Thanks again for joining me for my Scrappy Month 2. If you liked what you saw, please hit that like button and subscribe for more videos coming in the future. Once again, thanks for dropping by and have a quilty day. We'll see you next time in my quilt lab.